What are you doing this afternoon? A man's voice came over the line on the telephone. I didn't know if I was being harassed or this was someone friendly. He sounded friendly, but a harasser can sound that way too. Who is this? I asked. I'm wondering if you could run me into the doctor in town. The field was narrowing. It had to be one of my Amish neighbors. I hadn't lived in my place, an old Amish schoolhouse, for more than a year. I knew some of my neighbors, but not all of them. And I certainly didn't know them by the sound of their voices. Who is this? I asked again. Moses. Oh, Moses. Sure, I'll run you into town. I was stumped by the way the Amish seemed to lack manners. They were a very polite culture, but they didn't have the niceties I was used to. They never introduced themselves on the phone. They never said please or thank you. They might finish a conversation by just walking away. Does that sound familiar to you? You may have noticed the same thing if you've dealt with Amish people in some capacity before, whether it's in business or other interactions. That was from an article by Mary Swander in the Iowa Capitol Dispatch. And that article was the inspiration for this video. You may have noticed the same thing yourself, especially if you compare the way Amish communicate with the way non-Amish Americans communicate. I think there's less polite packaging around Amish speech than there would be in non-Amish speech. I personally think that the way non-Amish Americans communicate is probably over polite, too polite sometimes. It's definitely in contrast to the more direct and to-the-point manner that's typical among the Amish. There may be less small talk to warm up a conversation when you're talking with an Amish person, more abrupt transitions between topics when you speak with an Amish person. You may be left guessing if there was more to be said in the conversation in some cases. And again, I should say the typical disclaimer, the Amish is a generalization. Of course, Amish people are individuals and, people can be different, but talking about the culture in general here. Now, if that's been your experience, you might be nodding your head right now. And if that's the case, well, what might be the reason for that? We're looking at the Amish as a culture. Generally speaking, I think Amish may be more about getting to the point in their speaking simply as a matter of practicality, especially if you think about their large family sizes. A typical household, you've got to manage communication between not just 2 or 3 people, but 8, 10, 12, or more people. And there's maybe less space or less time, or maybe just less reason for being overly polite in those cases. Common example would be if you sit down with Amish at the dinner table. There's not a lot of, hey, excuse me, could you please pass the ketchup to me? It'll be one word, ketchup. Whoever's closest to the ketchup needs to reach out and hand it down to you. That's very practical, and people aren't getting offended in those cases because that's just part of the culture. Another reason that the Amish might seem rude, and I need to say here, I'm not saying that the Amish are rude. It's an interesting question, but another reason the Amish might seem rude is that it may be true that they're simply more comfortable with silence. Having silence, in a conversation, for many people, that's awkwardness. It indicates that, you need to fill that space up with more speech. That silence, in turn, can be interpreted as rudeness or a lack of manners. But if you look at silence in an Amish context, it functions in a different way. And there's a quote here I want to share with you from the book, The Amish Way, Patient Faith in a Perilous World. The authors discuss silence throughout the book, and to give one example, they write that silence exemplifies Gelassenheit, which is a person's willingness to accept things without demanding an answer to why they happened the way they did. Okay, they see that as representative of that quality or general trait of the Amish. They also quote in that book the scholar John Hostetler, who describes silence in Amish life as an active force used in a variety of contexts. Okay, so not to go too deep in that direction, but it may simply be they're more comfortable with silent spaces in speech. I've also thought perhaps this could be just a residual from their Germanic European cultural backgrounds. Generally, I think European cultures, maybe not all of them, but there is more direct speech and less politeness, especially again compared to American culture. Okay, maybe leaving out like the UK, of course. So maybe there's another reason though, and Mary Swander, who wrote this article I read from you at the beginning, looked into it a little bit deeper, and this is what she found. She wrote, Then why did the Amish, a religious society bound together through custom and tradition, skip over manners? At first, my interactions with the Amish seemed curt, abrupt, and a bit disconcerting. Maybe they didn't have words for please and thank you in their German dialect, and so the sentiment didn't translate into English. Maybe they weren't sure about me. A single English woman. Maybe they didn't want to interact with me, but I hadn't contacted them. They'd called me from one of their phone shacks in the middle of a cornfield. Maybe they just wanted to do business and not socialize at all. She continues, these interactions remained a mystery. I still took their calls and gradually got better at recognizing their voices. But they continued to speak without identifying themselves and seemed happy to let me guess. Then I did some research about their linguistic patterns and found out the Amish cut out the niceties in their speech for a reason. They thought that manners were an elitist construct. The use of such phrases as please and thank you would make them sound like the upper class, a class that was on a higher social rung than others and one that might condescend to others. I'd never heard that explanation before reading that in Mary Swander's article, and I think there might be something to that explanation, and especially when you consider that Amish in previous eras were more, were conscious about how their ways contrasted with other ways. And when you reject, the ways of a more progressive group, a faster group, that's one way of establishing your own group's identity. Okay, so possibly things like manners. You also see this in things like the clothing or the hairstyles or other indicators of lifestyle, and more obvious things like that. So that may also have applied to manners of speaking as well. Not to go too far down the historical sort of speculation, but I found it to be an interesting explanation. Now, I also want to just add one more thing here. I think there have been some changes over time within the Amish, but that would be due to one of the really big societal changes among the Amish, and that would be the development of businesses among the Amish, development of entrepreneurship, which would mean that more Amish are in businesses that interact with the non-Amish public now than were in the past. So in the past you had, 100 years ago, the majority of Amish were farmers, right? Nowadays, in some communities, the majority of Amish can be small business people. You may have some church districts that have no farmers at all in them. So these changes have drawn Amish into closer contact with non-Amish people, and that has in turn influenced their ways of communication. So you definitely will find Amish that are polite, that, especially if you go into a store where they're selling products, especially in more tourist areas, you're going to find that. And again, I'm not saying that Amish people aren't polite. There's certainly plenty of polite Amish people. I'm just speaking in sort of broad strokes about the culture, okay? And of course, if it's in a business context and you're trying to sell to a customer and, it's just natural that you'd want to be polite to that customer to get them to leave with happy memories and want to come back and do business with you again. So I think interactions with non-Amish people over time through business may have changed some of the patterns, I don't know what you call it, courtesy patterns or communication patterns amongst some Amish. But back to the original question, are the Amish rude? What do you think? Are the Amish rude? What has been your experience? What do you think about these explanations as to why Amish ways of speaking may be different from non-Amish ways? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. Hit subscribe, hit like, and I will see you next time.